Welcome to Crown TV. Immerse yourself with a captivating audio from our stories. We provide an alternative way to read books in audio. We upload many audiobooks as possible, from bestsellers to timeless classic. Subscribe and stay tuned for new upload.
Episode 271, Taking the Blame. Saul was surprised to hear Julian's voice on the other end. But from what Alex had told him, Julian and Chris were working together. And now Julian was answering Chris's phone. Clearly they were in the same place. "I've taken care of the security guards," Saul lied. "Great," Julian answered. "Good job, Saul." He sounded happy and relieved. "Are you at the hotel now?" "No, we're at my house. We're just having some fun." Julian paused for a moment before continuing. "Saul, you've done well. As a thank you, you can join us if you want. If not, then more for me." With that, Julian hung up the phone. Saul turned to Alex. "They're at Julian's house." "Take me there right now!" Alex shouted. He couldn't contain his anger. Saul didn't dare protest. "All right. My car is outside. I'll take you there." Alex followed Saul out of the building. When they came out onto the street, the crowd that had gathered due to the commotion started slinking away. They got into Saul's car and drove away. Over at Julian's house, Chris came out of the bathroom hand in hand with the girl he had been with. Giggling, she ran ahead to the bed. Julian looked at him. He had always felt close to his cousin. They shared the same interests, and sometimes they indulged in them together. "Was that my phone ringing?" Chris asked. "Was it Saul?" "Yeah, it was Saul," Julian answered with excitement. "The security guards are taken care of." "Already?" Chris was a little surprised. He trusted Saul to deal with things, but it had been less than 2 hours. The timing seemed off. "It's done!" Julian exclaimed triumphantly. He didn't have any doubts. He glanced at the girl on the bed. "Come on, let's celebrate. Take our mind off things." Chris smiled and felt his doubts melt away. He didn't know why he had hesitated, but he was back to normal. Meanwhile, Alex and Saul were getting closer. Julian lived in a luxurious community on the outskirts of Baltimore. When Alex and Saul approached, they saw that it was gated and protected by security guards. They drove up to the gate and were immediately approached by a security guard. "Who are you here to see?" the guard asked. "If you don't have a good reason to be here, you're not getting in." "We're here to see Julian," Saul exclaimed without looking at the security guard. He was anxious and uneasy. "He's expecting us. Call him and ask if you have to." The security guard became less sure of himself. 2 hours ago, he had seen Julian and Chris enter the community together, and he knew better than to disturb them when they were together. "Don't you recognize me?" Saul continued. "I'm telling you, call him if you're so unsure." Saul glared at the security guard with a fierce expression on his swollen face. In the dim light, his appearance startled the security guard. He remembered Saul. He had been on duty a month earlier when Saul had come to the community to do something for Chris. And he had heard of him. He had heard that he was an underground boxer and that he was a merciless fighter. He tried to compose himself, but on the inside, he was afraid of what Saul might do to him. "All right," he said. "Just calm down. You can pass." He opened the gate and Saul drove slowly up to Julian's villa. Inside, Chris and Julian had just finished their little celebration. Chris rose from the bed, walked over to the chair where his clothes were hanging, and took out his cigarettes. "Are you really taking a break?" Julian asked merrily. "The night's still young." Chris sat down on the chair, put a cigarette in his mouth, and lit it. The breeze from the window was cold. He got up and went over to close it when he suddenly froze. Outside, a car was coming into Julian's driveway. Saul's car. Chris grew nervous and stepped behind the curtain, watching closely what was going on below. Two people got out of the car. One of them was Saul. The other was the little security guard, the one called Alex, the one that Saul supposedly had gotten rid of. Chris's mind was spinning. It all makes sense, he thought. Saul lied on the phone before, and he lied because someone was threatening him. That someone must have been Alex. But how could Alex threaten Saul? He couldn't. Saul must be in on it. "Hey, Julian!" Chris exclaimed as he walked back to the bed. "What?" Julian asked. "What's wrong with you?" Before Chris could answer him, a loud bang rang through the house. It was the sound of the front door opening and shutting. Julian also heard it, and he rose from the bed in surprised anger. Chris forced himself to calm down, walked quickly over to Julian and whispered to him, "Whatever happens, follow my lead." Julian looked confused. The sound of footsteps came from the hallway. They came closer and closer. Chris and Julian stood silent, staring at the open doorway out into the hall, and Saul and Alex gradually appeared. The girls, who had been lying still on the bed up until this point, sat up quickly and hid under the bedsheet. Julian grew as pale as a ghost. "Saul, I don't know what's happened, but you better deal with this little prick," he shouted angrily. Alex could tell that he was frightened. Saul lowered his head and didn't answer. He knew that he couldn't take Alex on even if he wanted to. Alex looked at the two naked men and smiled. "Are you celebrating?" "What do you want?" Julian shouted and stepped warily away from Alex. "What do I want?" Alex responded. "If you were me, what would you want to do to you?" "Look, I really don't know anything about it," Chris blurted out. "I had no idea he would try to kill you." Saul and Julian were both taken aback. They both knew that killing Alex had been Chris's idea. But when Saul looked into Chris's eyes, he understood. He was playing a trick, and he needed Saul to play along. Julian gave Chris a puzzled look. He still didn't understand what was happening. Chris turned toward him. "Julian, why didn't you tell me? If I had known, I wouldn't have let you do it. It was a stupid thing to do." As he looked into Julian's eyes, he gave him a slight wink. Julian suddenly understood everything. Chris was asking him to take the blame. He was in a bind. If he accepted responsibility, he would suffer Alex's revenge. But if he didn't take the blame, Chris would never trust him again. And Chris's family was far more influential than his own. Losing their support would be a terrible blow. Julian had no choice but to do what Chris wanted. "I figured Saul could take care of it," he said to Chris with feigned remorse. "I was wrong." "So it was your idea?" Alex's eyes fixed on Julian, and temper flared. Episode 272, Fresh Wounds. Julian stared fearfully at Alex. He wasn't used to being in such a vulnerable position. Usually, he only needed to say his name, and nobody would touch him. "So what?" he said with a tremor in his voice. "What are you going to do about it? I'm Julian Devant, and my cousin here is a Stedman. If you touch me, you're dead meat." "So you can just do whatever you want, is that it?" Alex asked and started slowly walking over to Julian. "I'm warning you," Julian squealed as he stumbled backwards. He was deeply afraid. He stumbled up against the edge of the bed and sat down, feeling with his hands, and never taking his eyes off Alex. He slid over the edge of the bed until he came up against the wall. The girls moved over to the other side, but they didn't dare to get out. Sensing that he was boxed in, Julian lost the last remnants of his composure. "Please don't hurt me, man. I was just so angry. I didn't know what I was doing." Alex had reached the other side of the bed. Chris was standing behind him. He wasn't sure what to do. "I could probably strangle this guy right here," he thought. "I'm strong enough, and he's looking the other way. Now's the perfect chance." But just as he was about to reach out for Alex's neck, Julian pulled out a pistol from underneath the pillow beside him. He aimed it at Alex and smiled triumphantly. "I'd almost forgotten that I had this," he said. "Bet you didn't expect that, did you?" He stared at Alex for a few seconds, enjoying his victory. "Go to hell," he said, and pulled the trigger. Alex reacted with lightning speed. He didn't have the time to register what was happening around him. It was as if he had been taken over by some animal instinct. Julian's bullet hit the wall behind him. Julian was amazed. Alex moved with such speed that he didn't understand what had happened. When he finally realized, he immediately tried to point the gun at Alex again. But before he could pull the trigger, he saw a flash of light in the corner of his eye. A little knife came flying toward him and hit his hand. He dropped the pistol. Julian's hand throbbed with pain, and when he finally raised his head, he saw Alex standing over him. He had picked up the gun and was now pointing it at Julian. Julian was so scared that he couldn't speak nor move. He trembled and fell back onto the bed. "Would you like to know what it feels like?" Alex asked coldly. "No, please," Julian blubbered. He knelt down on the bed and pleaded with Alex. "Listen, I was wrong. I'm sorry. Please don't hurt me." "Get over here," Alex suddenly shouted to Saul. Saul came over and stood by his side. "Shoot him," Alex said, and gave the gun to Saul. If he wants to come after me and my friends, Alex thought, let him see what happens if you fail. I'm not Alex Ambrose anymore. My family isn't going to solve my problems. I need to find my own solutions. Saul took the gun and looked over at Julian. He trembled slightly. "I'm sorry, Julian." "Saul, don't you dare shoot me," Julian erupted in desperate anger. "I'll kill you." "Sorry," Saul repeated. He raised the gun slowly. He knew that if he didn't do what Alex said, he might be the one who was shot. Julian was shaking violently. He looked at Chris with pleading eyes. "Chris, please stop him. Come on, he's going to shoot me." "Saul," Chris exclaimed. Julian was overjoyed. His cousin would save him. He looked at Saul. "Put down the gun. You know who he is. If you don't do what he says, his family will hunt you down." "Julian," Chris interrupted softly. Julian looked back at him. His face looked sad, but determined. It didn't look like he's trying to stop Saul. Julian's heart started racing. "Get out of the bed," Chris continued. "Stand up and take the shot. If you're kneeling on the bed, it won't be clean. He might hit you in a bad place and you'll suffer." "He's not going to stop it," Julian thought. "He just wants it to be quicker." "Cousin, help me," Julian whispered in despair. "Come off the bed," Chris said, and pulled Julian onto the floor. He frowned. "It's no use begging. Just get it over with." Julian looked over at Alex. "Please, just let me go. My family's important. I'll give you lots of money. Just don't let him shoot me." Julian's pitiful begging only increased Alex's hatred for him. He turned to Saul. "Well, what are you waiting for?" Saul pulled the trigger. The deafening sound of a gunshot rang out, and Julian cried out and fell to the floor. His right leg was bleeding profusely. He lay there on the floor, grasping his leg and screaming in agony. "Good, it's settled. I'm leaving." Alex looked at Julian and then turned toward the door. He had done what he had came to do, and now he wanted to go to the hospital and see Don. Saul was standing over Julian with the gun still in his hand. He couldn't believe what he had done. Now he'd have both Julian's and Chris's families after him. "I have to get out of here," he decided. "If I'm caught by the police, they'll arrest me. But if I stay here, I'll be in the clutches of the Duvants and the Stedmans. Who knows what they'll do to me?" He ran out of the villa and disappeared out of the gated community. Julian was still lying on the ground, screaming, and the two girls on the bed were crouching in the corner. Chris was relieved. He had been smart enough to put all the responsibility on Julian. Otherwise, it might have been him who was shot. Ignoring Julian, Chris picked up his clothes, sat on the bed, and put them on slowly. Just as he had finished dressing, a team of security guards came rushing into the bedroom and saw Julian lying on the ground. They were all stunned. "Call an ambulance immediately," Chris barked at them. One of them took out his phone and dialed 911. "Chris," Julian muttered through the pain. "I did what you asked, and look what happened. Now you must help me get revenge. Find that security guard, and Saul too. We'll give them back 10 times worse." Chris walked over to Julian and squatted down beside him. He stroked his head gently and stared pensively out the window. I promise, I'll make him feel worse than dead, and then I'll end it. Chris had thought about his situation. It didn't matter what Julian wanted him to do. Alex was a skilled fighter, and he had declared himself Chris's enemy. He couldn't allow that. Once he had left the house and walked out of the community gate, Alex hailed a taxi and called Don. Once he found out which hospital Don had been taken to, he hurried there as fast as he could. He got out of the taxi and ran to the 3rd floor of the hospital. When he got to Don's room, he saw that his sister Daisy was there. Don was lying in bed, and his wound had not been treated. "Alex, you're here. Are you okay?" Don asked. When he saw the peaceful expression on Alex's face, he was relieved. "Don, how come they haven't taken care of you yet?" Alex asked anxiously. He was worried. "The hospital said that we didn't have enough money for surgery," Daisy said and touched Don's arm. Her eyes were full of worry. "We barely had enough to pay for this bed." She stood up, walked over to Alex and looked pleadingly into his eyes. "Alex, could you lend us some money for Don's surgery? I promise I'll pay you back. I'm still in school, but I can pay you back a little whenever I can. Please help us." Alex looked into her eyes. He had heard Don talk about how he worked to give her money while she was studying, but she was clearly not helpless. No matter how dependent she'd been on Don, Alex could see that she would do anything to pay him back. "We can't ask him to do that, Daisy," Don said. "Alex is also just a security guard, and he just started working. How could he lend us that much money?" Alex was deeply moved by Daisy's determination. Without saying a word, he turned around and left the room. Daisy almost started crying. "What are we going to do, Don? Your wound will get infected." She came over and sat on the edge of his bed, and she looked at him hopelessly. "It's okay, Daisy," Don said with a smile. "I'm tough. Let's just buy some rubbing alcohol and gauze and wrap me up." He put on a brave face, but he was dejected. Although he could understand Alex's decision, he couldn't help but feel disappointed. The surgery was expensive, but not ridiculously so. On a security guard's salary, it could be paid back in a few years. "Okay then," Daisy said and stood up. "You lie down and I'll go get what we need." Suddenly the door flew open, and someone came into the room. Daisy looked up in surprise. It was Alex. "Where are you going?" he asked. "I'm going to get stuff so we can clean the wound ourselves," Daisy answered. "I don't think that would be a good idea," Alex said bluntly. Just then, a doctor and 2 nurses followed him into the room. "Doctor," Alex exclaimed triumphantly, "please get my friend ready for surgery." Episode 273, The Interrogation. The doctor and the nurses went over to Don and looked him over. "Alex?" Don was very surprised. Alex didn't leave, he realized. He went out to get me a doctor. "Don't say anything," Alex answered. "Let's just get you that surgery." He felt a little bad that he had stormed out of the room without saying anything, but Daisy's pleading had made him furious that the hospital wouldn't operate on Don. That was why he had left and gone straight to the nurse's station to ask for the best surgeon in the hospital. The cost didn't matter, since he had the bank card that the Moon Girls had given to him. The nurses looked carefully at Don's wound, and then the doctor ordered him to be prepared for surgery. As they rolled his bed out of the room and down the hallway, Alex and Daisy went over to a group of chairs and sat down. "Thank you, Alex," Daisy said with gratitude. "Thank you for saving him. I promise I'll pay you back." She looked him in the eye, and his eyes sparkled with joy. "Don't worry about it. Don is my friend. He needs help. That's all that matters." He smiled at her. "That's kind of you," Daisy responded, and her face grew serious. "But you and Don have the same job. I know what you make. How could you afford it? I'll pay you back, I promise." "We can talk about it later," Alex said with a bitter smile. After Don's injury is healed, he thought, I'll tell them everything. A doctor came walking up to them. He seemed nervous. "Sir, would you please come with me? I have some documents for you to sign." "All right," Alex said. "Wait here, Daisy. If you're tired, take a rest. I'll go and check on Don afterwards." He stood up and followed the doctor down the hallway. When they went around a corner toward the doctor's office, he walked straight into the barrel of a gun. It was pointed right at his face. "Don't move," said the woman holding the gun. She was wearing a plaid shirt, and she glared at him with ink-black eyes. Her face was hard and determined. Somehow Alex knew that she would not hesitate to shoot him. He didn't move. He just stood there and looked quietly at her. Behind her, 2 men in police uniforms came walking up to him and restrained him. They put handcuffs on his wrists behind his back. The woman put the gun away, and the 2 policemen searched him. "He doesn't have a gun on him, ma'am," one of them reported. "Alex Ambrose, you're under arrest for the shooting of Julian Duvant," the woman said. "We're taking you back to the police station for interrogation." Unbeknownst to Alex, Chris had called the Baltimore police and told them that Alex and Saul had broken into Julian's house and shot him. Officer Chelsea Wood had been sent to find them, and she had quickly learned that Alex had gone straight to the hospital. Knowing his name, she had found him easily, and she had asked one of the doctors to lure him away from the other people. "I didn't shoot him, officer," Alex protested. "It had nothing to do with me. Saul did it alone." "So, it's somebody else's fault. How convenient." Chelsea gave Alex a contemptuous look. In her experience, the more the suspect protested and tried to shift the blame, the more likely he was to be guilty. "Alex?" Daisy asked as she came around the corner. When she saw that he was being detained, she grew animated. "What are you arresting him for? He's a good man. This is a mistake." "Don't worry," Chelsea told her. "If he's innocent, he'll be released. But if he's guilty, I'll take him to prison myself." She turned to the 2 policemen. "Take him away." The policeman nodded and escorted Alex out of the building. As they walked away, Daisy was left standing alone in the hallway. She was worried and confused, but there was nothing she could do. Her brother was still in surgery, and she had to wait for him. The policeman escorted Alex out of the building and shoved him into a police car. They got in and sat on each side of him, while a third policeman drove them back to the police station. Chelsea sat in the passenger seat in the front. "You've really gone and made a mess for yourself," one of the officers said. "Julian Duvant was taken straight to the emergency room. He's still in surgery. You'd better hope he pulls through." "I told you I didn't shoot him," Alex protested. "We'll find out soon enough," said Chelsea, who glared at him through the rear-view mirror. "Don't get worked up. It'll only make things worse for you." Something about her gave Alex a sense of relief. She seems like an honest and fair-minded person, he thought. If she's in charge of my case, at least I'll get a fair hearing. He stopped talking and looked out the window for the rest of the drive. In a few minutes, they arrived at the police station. Alex was directly taken to the interrogation room and was asked to sit down at the table. Chelsea and another officer sat down on the other side. "Why did you shoot Julian Duvant?" the male officer asked. He looked at Alex as if he had already decided that he was guilty. "I didn't," Alex responded. "It was a man named Saul who shot him." "If you don't come clean now, you'll only make it worse," the officer said and stared at Alex. "I would advise that you confess. You know, the guys you attacked are well known in this town. Good, upstanding people. We want to solve this thing as quickly as possible." "Dwight," Chelsea exclaimed, "don't bring your personal feelings into this." Dwight got worked up. "Come on, Chelsea, he's obviously guilty." Chelsea gave him a stern look. "You're no use in here right now. Go have a cigarette and calm down. I'll handle this on my own." He looked indignant. "You think I can't do my job? I'm not professional enough?" "Exactly. Now get out. That's an order." Chelsea pointed to the door. From her tone, it was clear that she would not tolerate anyone questioning her orders. Dwight looked at her. Her treatment of him had made him very angry, but he didn't dare to disobey her. The rumor was that Chelsea came from an influential family. Even the captain of the precinct was hesitant to reprimand her. He rose and stormed out of the interrogation room. Once he was gone, Chelsea turned back to Alex. "Now, tell me honestly, what's this all about?" Alex thought about it for a moment, and then he told her everything that had happened since that afternoon. Chelsea took notes the whole way through. When he was done telling his story, she put her pencil down on the table and looked at him. "So you're saying that Saul shot Julian on his own?" "Yes, and there's proof," Alex responded. "If you examine the gun, you'll find 3 sets of fingerprints. Mine, Saul's and Julian's. But mine won't be on the trigger. I picked the gun off the floor, but I never fired it. Only the other 2 did." "We're collecting evidence right now," Chelsea told him. "We'll find out whether you're telling the truth." She paused. "But from what you've just told me, you've still committed a crime. You coerced Saul into shooting Julian when he wasn't a threat to you. I'll still have to charge you. Julian ordered Saul to kill me and my friend, Alex protested. I stopped him, and then he brought me to Julian's house. He took out his gun and almost killed me. So I told Saul to shoot him. It was self-defense. No, it wasn't. Making someone else shoot an unarmed man isn't self-defense. And besides, your story doesn't hold up. I know who Saul is. He's a fierce fighter. And you say you just subdued him? And then you tell me that you were shot at and just got out of the way. Twice. It's like a fairy tale. I told you I'm not a liar. Whatever you are, we'll find out soon, Chelsea said and closed her notebook. We need to detain you until the truth comes out. She stood up, and Alex followed her lead. Her eyes suddenly flashed, and her right hand came flying in a wide arc right for Alex's neck. Alex was startled, but he had time to lower his head and let her hand pass safely through the air above him. Chelsea looked surprised that he had been able to dodge her blow, and she immediately went for his face again. Alex leaned backwards, and the blow grazed his nose. Then, he pushed the table forward with his legs. It slid across the floor and hit Chelsea in the thighs. She cried out in pain and took 2 steps back. When he saw her wincing in pain, Alex was overcome with remorse. I'm sorry, he said. Chelsea had only wanted to find out whether Alex could really have subdued Saul. If this is how he does with handcuffs on, she thought, then perhaps he's telling the truth. But she still wasn't sure. She held up her fists and rushed toward Alex. Once again, she aimed for his nose. Alex stayed calm. In his mind, her fighting skills were nothing to be concerned about. He twisted his body to avoid Chelsea's fist and moved toward her. She lifted her knee to kick him in the side, but he was quicker. He lifted his right leg and pinned her leg between his. She couldn't move. Let me go, she shouted. She grew angry, and she wriggled to get out of his grip. She lost her balance and fell backward onto the table. She pulled Alex down with her, and he fell on top of her. When they landed, he accidentally kissed her on the lips. Episode 274, Nowhere to Run. Alex and Chelsea stared at each other in confusion. Their faces were so close that they could feel each other's breaths. Neither of them moved. They didn't know what to do. As they lay there on the table, the door suddenly opened, and 2 policemen rushed into the room. They must have heard that something was going on inside. When they came into the room, they froze, evidently stunned at what they saw. Chelsea pushed Alex aside and stood up. He staggered backwards and nearly fell. The 2 policemen looked quizzingly at her, but neither dared to ask what was going on. Take him to a cell, Chelsea ordered. Then she glanced over at Alex. When she saw that he was looking at her, she turned pale and hurried out of the room. You're barking up the wrong tree there, kid, one of the policemen said. That one's as cold as ice. You're not going to get off any easier by trying to get with her. Now let's go. They grabbed Alex by the arms and led him over to the detention cells. Chelsea rushed off to her desk and sat down. She looked around for anything to distract herself with, but her mind was still in the interrogation room with Alex. She had never had time for boys. School and work had always come first for her. She had never been in a relationship, never even been kissed. And now she realized that Alex had stolen her first kiss. It's shameful, she thought. It's not the way I was raised. I'm not that kind of woman. She was flustered and felt her temperature rising. "Chelsea," a police officer shouted as he walked quickly toward her. "They've collected the evidence from Julian's villa. They're checking fingerprints and comparing blood samples now." Chelsea's attention immediately returned to the case. She looked at the police officer, and her eyes burned with reignited focus. "Thanks, I'll go and have a look." She got up and walked over to the forensics lab. Meanwhile, Captain Finn Murphy, the captain of the Central District Precinct, was returning to the station. He had been at home resting when he had received the call about the incident at Julian's house. He had immediately gotten dressed and hurried back to the station. A shooting involving members of both the Duvant and the Stedman families was bound to cause a stir. When he came into the station, the staff immediately stood up as a show of respect. Finn wasn't in the mood for formalities, and he looked around for someone who might know of any recent developments. "Larry," he said to one of them, who was standing over by the wall to the right. It almost looked as if he had been hiding. "In my office right now. I need to know what's happened." "Yes," Larry said cautiously. Finn had just grasped the handle on the door to his office when his phone rang. He looked at the caller ID and was taken aback. He stood frozen for a second and then turned to Larry. "Wait outside first. I'll call for you later." Larry walked away. Finn went into his office, sat down in his chair, took a deep breath and answered the phone. "Hello, Chris?" In the Baltimore underworld, the Stedmans were the only family that could match the Cliftons. In some ways, they were in an even more advantageous position. Art Stedman, the head of the family and Chris's father, was an influential politician with significant clout in the mayor's office and beyond. If Chris was calling him, then Finn knew he had to tread carefully. "Hello, Captain Murphy," Chris said. "I believe you've been informed about my cousin's case." "I know the broad strokes," Finn replied. "One of my officers was just about to fill me in." "There's no need," Chris said abruptly. "I'll tell you. My cousin was shot by two guys called Alex and Saul. They tried to kill him, but they failed. Now, I've been informed that you have Alex in your jail already. I hope I can count on you to make sure that he's kept there and that he's punished." Finn immediately understood that something fishy was going on. If we kept this Alex kid locked up, it'll be easy for Chris to get to him, he thought. That must be what he's after. But why is he going to all this trouble? "Is there a problem?" Chris asked coldly. "Oh, no problem at all," Finn answered hurriedly. He was frightened, and his voice and his body trembled. "Good. I expect to hear that charges are being filed very soon. Do you have any leads on Saul? I personally suspect that he's already dead. When you find him, please don't make a fuss. And no need for the usual song and dance. Just cremate him and be done with it. Yes, all right, Finn said. He grew more and more unsettled. He wondered if he had read Chris's implication correctly. Okay then, Captain. I won't disturb you any longer. You have work to do. Goodbye. Chris hung up. Finn put his phone away and called Larry into his office. Then he sat and listened as all the facts of the case were explained to him. Chris put his phone away. He was at the hospital where Julian had been taken, and Julian was being brought out of the emergency room. He was being rolled out in a wheelchair. His parents were there waiting for him, and they anxiously approached the doctor. "Doctor, how is his leg?" asked Patrick Duvant, Julian's father, and grasped the doctor's white coat sleeve. The doctor shook his head slowly. "We removed the bullet, but the injury has damaged his muscle tissue. He's not in any danger, but his leg will probably never fully recover." Patrick stared at him in disbelief for a few seconds, and then he suddenly erupted in anger. "You hacks! You couldn't even fix a simple bullet wound?" He looked as if he was about to attack the doctor. "If my son ends up lame, I promise he'll never work again." Julian was staring into the floor and looked as if he was going to cry. "I don't want to live if I'm not going to be able to walk," he said. His mother bent down and hugged him. "It'll be all right, Julian. We'll find a better hospital. They should never have brought you here. I'll make sure to find the best doctor in the country. We'll fix this, I promise." After Julian and his father calmed down, they went to the VIP wing of the hospital. Julian had been given a spacious room with a comfortable bed, and his father, his mother, and Chris gathered around him as he got into it. "They crippled me," he said as he lay down. Hatred shone in his eyes. "I want them to pay." He turned to Chris. "Chris, you must find them for me. I won't be able to breathe as long as they're still out there." "Chris, I heard you call that police captain earlier," Julian's mother observed. "Do you have a plan?" Patrick also looked to Chris. He knew that his nephew could be trusted to handle things. He's already on top of it, he thought hopefully. He'll make this right. "Don't worry," Chris told them. "The police have already caught Alex. I just called the captain of the precinct where he's being held, and I made it clear that he shouldn't go easy on him. As long as Alex is locked up, it'll be easy to get to him." Julian's face lit up. "That's great," he exclaimed. "If he's put in prison, he'll be an easy target. If we can, we should make sure he's put in the worst possible place. He won't survive the first week. If he does, I'll take care of him myself." Julian stopped himself. He seemed to have remembered something. "But what about Saul? We can't let him get away. I mean, he's the one who actually shot me." "Don't worry," Chris answered confidently. "Saul's one of mine. I can deal with him easily." The Duvants were all somewhat surprised at his confidence. Saul wasn't just anyone. He was a veteran of their dirty work and a champion of underground boxing. But they trusted Chris entirely. And besides, he had the resources of his family. If he told them he would take care of it, then that is what he would do. Chris smiled at them and looked at his watch. It was as if he knew what they were thinking. I don't think Saul has much time left. It's now 1 o'clock. I doubt he'll make it to 2. Chris had thought the whole thing through. Saul was rash. His first thought would be to run away. As powerful as Chris's family was, he was skilled enough to have a 50-50 chance of getting out of the country. But Chris knew Saul's weakness. It was a woman. And not just any woman, but someone Chris had introduced Saul to himself. Chris did something similar with every employee who didn't already have a family that could be exploited. And Saul is particularly smitten with this one, Chris thought. There's no way he'll run without her. And when he comes for her, my man will be waiting for him. Meanwhile, Saul was driving up to the apartment of his girlfriend, Danielle. If he was going to have to leave town, he wanted to take her with him. When he got to her building, he got out of the car and went inside. He went up the stairs and knocked on her door. "Danielle," he shouted. "Open the door." The door crept open, and a short-haired beauty appeared in the crack. Her face looked strained, but Saul didn't have time to notice. "Danielle, let's go," he said. "I'll take you out of Baltimore." He grabbed Danielle by the arm and tried to lead her downstairs. "Hello, Saul," a voice cried out. Saul had been in such a hurry that he hadn't noticed the man standing behind Danielle. It was Cyrus, one of Chris's men. He held a gun in his hand and pointed it at Danielle. Saul was stunned. Chris had anticipated his every step. "Come inside and no one gets hurt," Cyrus said. Danielle was shaking with fear. "All right," Saul answered and raised his hands. "There's no need to do anything drastic. I'll do as you say." He stepped into the apartment and closed the door behind him. Episode 275, Calling the Shots. Once Saul was safely inside the apartment, 2 of Cyrus's men came forward and searched him. They confirmed to Cyrus that he was unarmed, and then they forced him to kneel. Saul instinctively tried to stand up again, but he stopped when the 2 men drew their guns on him. He counted the people in the room. There were 6 of them, not including Danielle. "Saul!" Danielle blubbered with tears in her eyes. Cyrus was holding a gun to her head. At that moment, all Saul wanted was to get her to safety. "Let her go," he said calmly. "I'll go with you to see Chris." Cyrus laughed. "See Chris? What are you talking about? You're never leaving this room." Saul's mind started racing. "This can't be happening," he thought. "I've been working for Chris for years. He wouldn't just kill me. I need to talk to him. He was there when I shot Julian. He knows I had no choice. I'm Chris's right-hand man," he said and looked Julian in the eye. "I want to speak to him, and you don't have the right to deny me." Cyrus hesitated. He knew how much Chris had always valued Saul. Perhaps if he had time to think about it, he wouldn't want him dead. He thought for a moment, and then he took out his phone and called Chris. After a few signals, someone answered on the other end. "Chris, we've caught Saul," Cyrus said. "At Danielle's place, just like you said. He wants to talk to you. The voice on the other end said something to him, and he walked over to Saul and held the phone against his face. Saul composed himself. "Chris, you were there. You know I had no choice. I've worked for you for years. You can't just off me like this. I'll take any punishment. You know that I won't complain. But not this."
"Is that Saul?"
a voice said in the background on the other end. It was Julian. He came forward and shouted directly into the phone. "You crippled me, you scumbag! You want punishment? Fine. I'll make you wish you were dead." Julian stopped himself. When he continued speaking, his voice was calmer. "You're going to learn something. Something Chris should have taught you. I'll teach you what happens when you cross the wrong people." Saul was seething with anger, but he kept it bottled up. He still had a glimmer of hope that Chris might let him live. Chris's voice came back to the phone. "Listen, Saul," he said. "You've made one mistake too many. I'm sorry, but there's no coming back from this." Saul lost his cool. "Chris, I fought for you! I would have given my life for you! And this is how it ends?" Chris didn't answer. Cyrus put the phone back against his own ear. "Yeah, I understand," he said. "Don't worry. I think I'll make it clean." "Chris!" Saul cried out in a hurry. If Chris hung up the phone, all would be lost. "Do what you want to me. But I have one last request. Let Danielle go. Let her go back to her hometown and don't trouble her again." "She's my employee, Saul," he heard Chris saying. "I'm not just going to release her. I'm the one who sent her to you." "What'll happen to her?" Saul said. He clenched his fist. "What always happens to my girls," Chris said dismissively. It was clear that he was done talking. Saul was at a breaking point, and he clenched his fist tighter and tighter. Suddenly, Julian's voice came back into the phone. "No, much more than that," he said. "I'll take her for myself. Once you're gone, I'll enjoy her company every day." He started laughing. That was the last straw. Saul erupted. He stood up and rushed the two men who had guns on him. He grabbed one of them and tried to wrest his gun from his hands while using his body to shield himself from being shot by the other. The two men were startled and immediately started firing their guns. Saul managed to avoid the first few shots, but then he was hit in the shoulder and the thigh. The pain surged through him, but he endured it. He managed to yank the gun from the man's hands and quickly struck them both over the head with it. They fell to the floor unconscious. Cyrus and the others were pointing their guns at him. He reacted quickly and threw himself behind the sofa to his left. Shots rang out, but none of them hit him. The air in the room was filled with splinters, sawdust, and glass. Danielle was scared to death. She covered her ears and tried desperately to run over to Saul. Cyrus tried to grab her, but he was too slow. He raised his gun and fired. She fell motionless to the ground. The gunfire stopped. "Danielle?" Saul cried out. He couldn't see what was happening. There was no answer. "You'll pay for this!" Saul roared and rose. He unloaded his magazine on Cyrus and his remaining cronies. The sudden burst of gunfire caught them off guard. 3 of them fell, and Cyrus was hit in the right arm. He dropped his gun on the floor. When the gunfire settled down, Saul realized he had been hit inside. The adrenaline and his anger kept him standing. Cyrus sat against the wall, held his hand to his arm in an effort to stop the bleeding. Saul walked slowly over to him. His expression was completely blank. He grabbed Cyrus by the collar and punched him repeatedly in the face. "Please, don't," Cyrus muttered as Saul kept pummeling. Then he stopped speaking. Saul let him go, and he fell to the floor. Saul looked at him. It was over. But when he stood there looking at Cyrus, he was struck by the reality of what had just happened. His anger and despair came back with increased intensity. He cried out in agony, kicked Cyrus several times, and punched the wall repeatedly. His hands were covered with blood, and his gunshot wounds ached terribly. Now that it was over, he felt the state he was in. A faint voice echoed in the room. Saul looked over and saw Cyrus's phone on the floor next to him. The phone call was still connected. He hobbled over to the phone and picked it up. "What happened?" Chris asked. For once, he sounded anxious. "Is it done?" "Chris," Saul whispered. He spoke calmly and gently, which made Chris's heart tremble. "I'm still here, Chris," he continued. "Can't say the same for the other guys, though. Or for Danielle." At the thought of her, his voice broke. He suddenly started crying. "Don't worry, Chris. I'll let you pay me back. We'll work something out. Something reasonable, given your family's wealth. I'll come and collect soon." He hung up. He dropped the phone and looked over at Danielle. He walked slowly over to her. He sat down beside her, rested her head on his leg, and gently stroked her hair. "I'm sorry," he said. "I know I said we'd travel the world. I shouldn't have made so many promises." He bent down and kissed her forehead. It seemed to him that she was sleeping and that he was just chatting with her. There was blood on her face. "You're dirty," he said. "I'll wipe it off for you." He rubbed the stain with his thumb, but it only increased in size. The reality of what had happened struck him again. He held her tightly and sobbed. Chris put his phone away and frowned. Saul was nothing to him. He was a lackey. A lackey who was only good for following orders, who had no will of his own. Lower than an animal. And yet, Saul had dared to speak to him as if he were in charge. He had threatened him. Chris simmered with anger.
Thank you for listening to Crown TV. Please don't forget to subscribe, share and turn on the notification button.